Well, the last time I was there about a week and a half ago, I sat in between a 9-year-old girl and her father. And let me give you an example of how ugly ICE has become towards these folks and families. They took the dad, they picked him up off the street and took him to the detention center, the holding center, and then they intimidated him and threatened him, forced him to go lure his daughter out of their house. And the Ring camera, we put the video up, it shows it, to lure her so that they could take her as well. And so I'm sitting there, and this dad is breaking down crying because he feels guilty that he's the reason that she's there at the detention center. And she's sitting there, and she was actually trying to stay in a positive mood, and she was able to see some letters from her classmates and everything at school. But that's the extent that we're talking about that ICE has gone to really cause this psychological emotional harm to young people.
Texas has been at the center of the latest surge in immigration enforcement activities. According to the latest numbers, the month of July saw a significant uptick in arrests carried out by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, a whopping 50,000. Texas, along with Florida, account for 20,000 of those arrests. This increase is no accident. As we have been reporting on at Breakthrough News, the Trump administration in July set new arrest quotas, betting on their allegedly more covert operations to be able to carry out raids and arrests unnoticed. ICE also received record levels of funding thanks to the US Congress. Consequently, cities across the United States have registered increased ICE presence and activity. Meanwhile, conditions for those who are arrested and shuffled around between for profit detention centers have only deteriorated. Of the over 200 ICE detention centers across the United States, a significant number of those centers are concentrated in Texas, as well as Louisiana and California. One of the most infamous detention centers in Texas is the CoreCivic run Dilley Detention Center, where dozens of children are being held and being subjected to inhumane conditions and deprived of their basic human rights. The Trump administration's mass deportation campaign has been met with resistance at all levels. Joining us today is one of the people that has been at the forefront of resisting the Trump administration's mass deportation campaign in the legislative sphere. And we are joined by U.S. Representative for Texas's 20th District, Joaquin Castro. Rep Castro, thank you so much for joining us here at BT Live.
Yeah, great to be with you all. Thank you all for discussing this too.
Yeah, definitely. And, Representative Castro, for the past several weeks, you have been visiting different detention centers across Texas. So, first, we wanted to hear from you, what you have seen in these visits and what is the role played by private groups like CoreCivic and GEO in worsening the conditions that are faced by immigrants in these detention centers? And why are you and dozens of others calling for DHS to end its contract with CoreCivic?
Well, first, when you go in there, it's clear that the people, but especially the children, are traumatized. These places are not like homes. It's not like going to a nursing home. These are prisons. Dilley is a trailer prison, and the other adult-only facilities, like in Carnes and Pearsall and Laredo, those are actual prisons with razor wire and steel doors and all of the trappings of a prison. And so when I've gone to Dilley and I talk to the kids, I mean, you've got kids that are sobbing, kids that are stone faced, some that you can tell are resentful or mad at their parents because they're in that situation. The parents who are all torn up because they feel responsible for the fact that their kids ended up there. So the psychological and emotional trauma to folks is going to be long lasting. And by the way, remember, the overwhelming majority of these people, including all of the people at Dilley, uh, none of the people at Dilley have any kind of criminal record. So you're talking about people who are in a trailer prison who have committed absolutely no crime at all. And so the conditions, of course, you've heard about the worms in the food, the problems with the food, dirty drinking water, all of those things are problems that continue.
No, really, really appreciate you breaking that down. And one thing that you've been advocating for, Representative Castro, is for the termination of the 287G agreements in Texas. There are currently dozens of cities across the state that have these agreements, and it undoubtedly has helped accelerate the rate of arrests. So, can you explain to us why you're advocating for this right now and why these agreements are so dangerous?
Well, under Donald Trump, the number of these agreements just exploded. And now there's thousands across the country and hundreds in Texas. And these agreements have basically turned local sheriff's offices, police departments into full blown immigration officers. And so people will ask the question, well, how is ICE picking up so many people on the street? Well, it's because they're working hand in hand with local police departments or county sheriff's departments so that when there's a traffic stop, they start questioning somebody about whether they've got their documents, whether they've got their papers, whether they're legal. Oftentimes they end up harassing, not only obviously undocumented folks, but also legal permanent residents and U.S. citizens, and a lot of people who are here on asylum claims that had permission to come into the country, and yet they're still being put into these prisons. But there were 11 of us, I believe, that signed on to that letter saying that Dilley should be closed, and then there were about a bunch of state reps and a bunch of local officials in Bexar County in San Antonio who said to 6 cities within our county, you ought to terminate these 287G agreements because ICE has become an abusive, rogue organization that is violating the Constitution and violating people's civil rights.
I mean, it's truly, truly horrifying. But I did want to dig in a bit more about this question of the private groups that are actually profiting from this very system of detention and, these mass arrests that we're seeing take place across Texas and across the country. So, can you talk a little bit about the role of GEO Group, CoreCivic, in, this web of what is
Yeah.
this mass deportation campaign?
Yeah, so there's two main private prison groups, for-profit private prison groups in the U.S. That's the GEO Group and CoreCivic. And ordinarily, help run state prisons, for example, or perhaps federal prisons. But here, they're running these immigration detention centers. And CoreCivic specifically is operating the Dilley Detention Center, which I call the Dilley Trailer Prison. And they're basically making money off of child imprisonment. I mean, this is a privately held company with American investors and investors from all over the world who are making money for each child that is thrown into Dilley, each pregnant woman that's thrown into Dilley. These folks make more money. And it's a multi-billion dollar business. At Dilley, for example, they charge everybody 75 cents per minute per call. So 75 cents. I mean, the cost of cell phones now. I mean, I could call Europe for less than 75 cents a minute.
Yeah.
So they're trying to really abuse these folks, make money in every single way that they can. And I've said that it represents in the United States of America the commodification of child imprisonment. And I know that we've got a juvenile justice system, and there are 15 or 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds who may go into the juvenile justice system, but those folks have gone through a court process, have been found to be guilty of some kind of crime. Here, you're talking about 2-month-old babies who have been at Dilley, 2-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds who have committed no crime at all, and the investors in CoreCivic are making money off of their imprisonment.
Really horrifying. And, just to ask a little more, because I know you have been visiting these centers. I think a lot of people, read reports, they can kind of see tweets that go out, Instagram videos about, just how bad the conditions are. But I think it's quite different to have seen what you've seen, to have spoken to people who are, locked up in these places, and, just even looking at your social media and the stories that you've been able to share from there are really, really moving. So I just wanted to ask if you can share some of the stories that you've heard over the past couple of weeks of, just who's ending up in these centers.
Well, the last time I was there about a week and a half ago, I sat in between a 9-year-old girl and her father. And let me give you an example of how ugly ICE has become towards these folks and families. They took the dad, they picked him up off the street and took him to the detention center, the holding center, and then they intimidated him and threatened him, forced him to go lure his daughter out of their house. And the ring camera, we put the video up, it shows it, to lure her so that they could take her as well. And so I'm sitting there, and this dad is breaking down crying because he feels guilty that he's the reason that she's there at the detention center. And she's sitting there, and she was actually trying to stay in a positive mood, and she was able to see some letters from her classmates and everything at school. But that's the extent that we're talking about that ICE has gone to really cause this psychological, emotional harm to young people.
So horrifying. Well, Representative Castro, you've been working with a group of over 100 members of Congress and pushing for the release of all families and end to the DHS CoreCivic agreement and other immediate measures to respond to what should really be framed as a humanitarian crisis. However, in the last year, it's hard not to notice that several members of your party have actually done the complete opposite and even voted for an increase in DHS and ICE funding. So, my question for you is, how do you reconcile the support of some Democrats for increasing funding for ICE in this particular moment in time?
Well, you're right. Look, probably 90 something percent of Democrats have voted against that funding, but there are a sliver of folks who, as you say, have. And I fundamentally disagree with their decision. I think that if you look fairly reasonably, not even as a Democrat, as an American, about how ICE is conducting itself, about how it's violating people's rights, I don't think that you should give more money to that kind of agency. I think at this point, ICE should be disbanded, that it should have no role in immigration enforcement. I feel as though what we've seen, their behavior, particularly over the past year and a half, they have forfeited that right as an agency to be involved with it. So you're right. There are a handful of Democrats that have voted that way. I fundamentally disagree with it, and I'll keep trying to prevail upon them as these votes come up.
And then on that note, there are midterms coming up. It is, expected that perhaps Democrats could take back the House, maybe even the Senate. And if that happens, you're still going to have a Trump administration in office. But obviously Republicans wouldn't be in charge of the legislative branch. So, do you have plans for how to deal with some of the really horrific policies that you're laying out? And it kind of goes beyond just ICE DHS, because attached to that is this massive acceleration in the entire hemisphere, right? With like the Dun Roe doctrine, the boat strikes, these extrajudicial killings of largely these like poor fishermen at sea. So yeah, I'm just curious, as we look ahead, are there plans to really tackle that head on if Democrats are able to take back the legislative branch?
There are absolutely plans to hold the Trump administration accountable in so many different areas of law and policy. And you mentioned a few of very important ones. The thing that you can do right now, and that what we have been doing, is preserving the record and preserving the facts and collecting as much information as we can, so that when Democrats are in charge of the oversight committee, for example, with Robert Garcia, who I believe will become chairman, and the other committees as well, so that we can then go investigate exactly, what I believe has been a lot of wrongdoing, illegal activity, and people should be held accountable.
Yeah, and just last thing before we let you go, a new facet perhaps of the Trump administration that we've seen really intensify over the past 6 months has been this aggressive pivot towards Latin America in terms of policy towards Mexico, towards the Caribbean, as Rania just mentioned, ramping up efforts to strangle Cuba, the island nation, which is currently under a fuel blockade. And we know that actually all of these policies are the ones that drive immigration in the first place. People don't leave their homes simply because, they want to leave their homes. People leave their homes and oftentimes because they're forced to, because of the same U.S. policy that is making their life at home unlivable. So I guess in the similar vein, how how are people acting to kind of both take these immediate measures to make, detention conditions less miserable, but also addressing the root cause, which is not just something that has happened under the Trump administration, but has been advanced by, both parties in trying to, submit and make Latin America submit to U.S. policy.
Well, I've always believed that we should work with the nations of Latin America as partners. That this hemisphere, if you look at the hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere, we have incredible potential. We have amazing people, amazing businesses, just a lot of potential if we work well together, if we collaborate. But what we've seen with Donald Trump is that he's intent on dominating people and dominating countries. And you can see what he's trying to do to Canada right now, for example. And so he's done the same thing in Latin America. And part of it also is this corrupt drive to enrich his cronies. They're over there in Venezuela figuring out how they can help different cronies of Donald Trump make a bunch of money off of the government of Venezuela. And that's what they're doing right now. And so, yeah, it's going to take some time to repair that damage. And the other thing is, the United States Congress thinks a lot about the competition with China and China building stronger relationships around the world and so forth. Well, this has been an open invitation for China to come into Latin America without trying to bully them, offering them technology like Huawei and BYD cars and so forth, and try to build those relationships. And so you're right. I mean, for a president and a Republican Party that talks about how we can't give China an opening and how we got to stop migration, you're doing the things that make migration a bigger issue because you're starving the economies of these countries, so people are going to leave, and then you're ruining the reputation of the United States in countries in Latin America. And so, of course, China is going to it's going to make it easier for them to move in and build relationships with these folks. And that's exactly what we're seeing more and more.
Well, Representative Castro, thank you so much for joining us here in BT Live. And, of course, we will be following all of the efforts that you're undertaking in the state of Texas and on a national level in the fight against these detention centers and this, inhumane and cruel mass deportation policy of the Trump administration. So thank you for joining us here in BT Live.
Great to be with you all.